Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of Addicted to Books. I'm your host, YA, and in today's episode, I'm going to give you a summary of The Courage to Be Happy. It's written by Ichiro Kishimi and Fumitake Kago. In the third episode, I managed to give you a summary of The Courage to Be Disliked. And just like the other book, this book is in a dialogue format between the youth and the philosopher. And this book aims to show us how to put Adler's concepts into practice, and it explains how true contentment is in our power. How true contentment is in our power. In the previous summary, if you remember, the philosopher had said it's easier for people to understand Adler's concept, but it's really hard for them to put it into practice. In this book, it's been 3 years since the youth and the philosopher had the discussion in The Courage to Be Disliked. And since then, the youth resigned from his post as a librarian and became a teacher, and he had the intention of putting Adler's teaching into practice. He calls the philosopher because he is frustrated with Adlerian psychology, and he's mad at the philosopher for introducing it to him. When the youth comes back to the philosopher, his aim is to challenge him that Adler's ideas do not hold up in the real world, and he wants him to stop corrupting other people with his ideas. From The Courage to Be Happy, the aim of the authors is to show us how we can make concrete progress on the path to happiness. It's also to show us how we can put Adler's psychology into practice every day, and also what is the conclusion that was arrived by Adler. Let's just dive into it. The youth explains that he lost hope in Adler and the philosopher because he feels that Adler's ideas have no use in actual society. And this is because when he joined the teaching profession to practice the kind of education with Adler's ideas, he believed these ideas would be easy to instill in children. He didn't praise and he didn't rebuke the students, and as a result of this, his students became unruly. And the youth says, while he feels like Adler's ideas are wonderful, they do not hold water in the actual world. They are ideals and they are also impractical. When he realized this, he decided to praise and rebuke the students, but still this didn't work out since the students already had no respect for him. The philosopher explains that majority of the people misunderstand Adler. He explains that even he didn't understand it right away, but he was able to understand and practice Adler's ideas through his child. The philosopher adds that to understand Adler, you need to understand love. Let's just dive into part 1, which is titled The Bad Person and Poor Me. The youth starts off by asking, what is the difference between Adlerian philosophy and religion? And the philosopher explains that religion explains the world through stories, while philosophy rejects those stories. And he explains that philosophy uses abstract concepts that have no protagonists, and that our philosopher is more of a living attitude than a field of study. And the philosopher also goes on to explain that the purpose of education is self-reliance. He says that studying is a child's task and the parent or educators have no right to intervene. Instead, your purpose as an educator or an adult is to offer assistance and encouragement. And if you recall, in the previous episode, rather in the previous book, we spoke of separation of tasks. This is where the separation of tasks come in, where the objective of the child is to study and the objective of the adult is to offer encouragement for them. The philosopher also says it's because of other people and society that we study knowledge. In short, we study how to live with others, how to allocate our place, and we understand how to live with other people. Basically, this is human knowledge. And this is not something that is gained from books, but is learned from being in relationships with other people. So in short, if you were in the world all alone, there'll be no need for you to study. So also, they go on to talk about the difference between respect and fear. And the philosopher explains that fear is subordination and faith. Basically, it's a state in which one fears power and authority and worships false images without seeing anything of the other person. And he also says, whenever there is fear, there is no respect. And I think this is something that a lot of people can relate to, because just a quick example, maybe your boss or maybe your guardians or just strict adults or something like that. So that's basically fear, and there's no respect there. And respect is seeing people as they are, and it's basically being aware of people's unique individuality and letting them grow and unfold as they are. And it's also not trying to change or even manipulate them. So basically, you accept them as they are and you don't set any conditions. And once you do this, they will get the courage to also accept themselves. And basically, this is how we should be. We should have respect for everyone, even those that we'll never meet. Let's say someone is in maybe America and maybe you're in China. Yeah, so basically you should have respect for them, because at the end of the day, we're human beings. You should have respect for human beings. So the two things that can't be forced are respect and love. So the philosopher gives a very simple example, the example of the boss and the employee. The boss may shout that the employees must respect them, but they're basically creating an environment of fear. If there's no mutual respect, then there's no relationship as human beings. So how does one show respect? Because respect doesn't come with words. And one thing about children is that they can detect your pretense. And one does not pay attention to someone they do not respect. So respect comes from your actions. So they also talk about the difference between sympathy and empathy. When it comes to empathy, empathy is having concern for other people's concerns. So basically, we do not live in an objective world, but instead we live in a subjective world, and that we ourselves give meaning to. So the issue we should focus on is not how the world is, but how we are and how we see the world. Also, we cannot escape subjectivity. And this is basically all about empathy. You try to see through someone's eyes, you try to hear through someone's ears, and you try to feel through someone's heart. And of course, yes, we cannot become another person, but you can imagine how others feel. If you think, what if I had that kind of heart and life like the other person? And this will help you understand, and it will help you how to deal with their situation. And sympathy I think is something that a lot of people do, and it's basically agreeing with other people's opinions and sharing with their feelings. And this is something that we're all guilty of. So I hope now you're able to understand that empathy is a skill. It's basically a skill where you have concern for other people's concern. It's also an attitude that you're working side by side another person. And sympathy is basically agreeing with other people's opinions and sharing their feelings, as simple as that. So, when we move to part 2, it's titled The Reason Why One Can't Change. So, the philosopher says, when you look at other people's speech and conduct, think of the goal hidden behind them. And he also reminds us that the past doesn't exist because it's something we can't change. If you remember the previous book, the philosopher spoke of this, and he said we can't live in the past and we choose our now, because the past doesn't define our future, and the only thing which defines our future is our now, and also the only thing that defines our past is our now. So he also goes on to talk about why we should negate reward and punishment. So the philosopher used his experience as an example, where he said when he was a child, he used to use a magnifying glass to burn ants he saw on the ground. He explains that children do certain things not because they're bad people, but because they do not know. And in this case, as an adult, you are supposed to teach them, and when you do this, there is no need for you to rebuke them. Because we all start from a place of not knowing. We should teach with words of reason and also without getting emotional. So, in order to help the youth understand why his students behave that way, the philosopher explains to the youth the goals of problem behavior. The philosopher asks the question, why do people engage in problem behavior even though they know this is something that's wrong? He explains to the youth, once you understand this, you'll be able to understand whether it's right or wrong to rebuke. So, in order to assist the youth understand why his students are being unruly, so if you recalled, the youth said he neither rebuked or praised his students, and his students still are unruly. So, the philosopher explains the goal of problem behavior to the youth in order to make him understand whether it's right or wrong to rebuke his students. The philosopher lists 5 stages of human problem behavior, and the first stage is demand for admiration, where he says the goal of this stage is for the person to get praise and to gain a privileged place in the community. They play this role of the good person to other people, and for example, kids play this obedient role to teachers and employees to their bosses. So when these actions do not get them the praise they were looking for, they stop making the efforts and they also lose the motivation. And in order to avoid people getting into this first stage, we need to show people they have worth by giving them respect. So the second stage is attention drawing, where the person's principle is to stand out and to get a definite position in the community. And this is different from the first stage because they create this space where they are a special person or they have a special place, and even if it takes the form of rebuke. So again, the philosopher says, through respect, we can convey that there's no need to be special and that they already have worth just as they are. So in the third stage, the goal is to plunge into power struggle, where the person will resist and they'll also provoke those who are around them. They will break rules without a second thought. So once you rebuke, you are giving into their provocation. And to deal with this, you need to get off the battle as soon as you detect it. If it's an ego issue, the philosopher advises that you deal with it legally. So the fourth stage is the stage of revenge, and the person takes revenge on those who didn't recognize them in the previous stages. So all this are just an expression of a love-starved person. So the final stage is the proof of incompetence, where even though the person has taken every step to be treated as a special being, it's not going as planned. And they start to hate their life and they try to run away from all tasks and every role, and this is in order to not get hurt. And in this situation, you turn to a specialist to assist you, for example a therapist or a counselor. So the philosopher explains that rebuking is not effective because the crime does not go away when there's punishment. He says that we should focus on their goals and figure out what to do now and also not the cause, because violence is a low cost and an immature means of communication. And he says when you rebuke, you want them to submit. This is a violent force. In part 3, the philosopher talks of how one can choose one's life. And he says, People are responsible for being stuck in their own juvenile conditions. And basically, this is the condition of not attaining self-reliance. He urges people to have the courage to use their own reason. And he explains the reasons why people reject self-reliance is because, in some cases, people are coward, or other people find it easier to live in accordance to the direction of another person. When people do this, they do not have to think of the difficult things, and also one doesn't have to take responsibility for failure. The philosopher explains that parents who meddle in their kids or engage in excessive nurturing of their children results to children growing up to be people who can't decide anything on their own and may need constant direction from others. He also says through encouragement, one can aid in self-reliance. He also explains we should negate praise-based development because rewards bring competitions. He reminds us that all people are equal and we should see each other as comrades and not as competitors. He also brings in the feelings of inferiority, which was discussed in the previous book, and he explains that civilization is a need for humans to compensate their lack of strength. So he also goes on to talk about trust and confidence, where he, as you remember in the previous book, they also spoke on it. So I'm not going to dive into it once more. So after this, the philosopher dives into more topics that were discussed in the previous book, basically the difference between trust and confidence, and he brings in the tasks of love, which is also touched on in the previous book. He also talks of all human problems being interpersonal, and also happiness being interpersonal relationships, and he also explains what happiness is, and also about the sense of belonging in your community. And in their courage to be happy, as much as it's a repetition, they also dive in and they give you a guideline. And from what I got from the book, it's you who's in charge of how you lead your life. It's you who's in charge of how you interpret things. It's you who's in charge of basically everything, and regardless of your circumstance, it's you who's supposed to make the decisions to become the person that you want to be or even to progress. So it's a very short book, and I'd recommend everyone to go check it out. I'd recommend everyone to read it as many times as possible to help you understand adolescent psychologies and see you life from a different perspective. And I believe this is something that will help you grow, progress, and understand certain things, and just become a better person in general. So thanks for listening, and remember, make sure to social distance and stay safe. Bye.